Welcome to the Shadowverse Chronicles original story and presentation of The Personal Line. Chapter 1.
The fluorescent glare of David Smith's phone display read 7:12 a.m. as he descended into the subway station. His thumb swiped across the commute tracking app with practiced precision, logging another data point in his 5-year documentation project. The screen's cold light caught his reflection in the smudged station wall, dark circles under eyes that had begun seeing too much. Each footstep echoed against worn concrete, a metronome marking time's erosion. David counted them reflexively. 17 steps to the first landing, 32 to the platform. Numbers had always been his shelter, ever since childhood panic attacks had taught him to quantify his way through fear. Now, after half a decade of teaching computers to find patterns in chaos, he'd developed an almost pathological sensitivity to deviations from established sequences. The platform's artificial atmosphere pressed against his skin. Overhead, fluorescent tubes flickered in patterns that nagged at his pattern recognition. Microsecond hesitations between pulses, rhythms that suggested meaning before collapsing into noise. David's fingers tightened around his briefcase handle, its weight a tether to routine as he navigated the morning crowd. He claimed his coordinates with mathematical precision. Third car, left side, second row from the back. The familiar faces around him resolved into their assigned variables in his mental probability matrix. Mrs. Crossword, P097 daily occurrence, sat directly across, her pencil scratching solutions into empty boxes. The sound scraped against his nerves today, the graphite's whisper lagging fractionally behind her hand movements, like poorly synchronized audio. Financial Times, P089, maintained his usual fortress of newsprint, the pages forming exact right angles that David's mind automatically calculated. To his left, Headphones Girl, P093, swayed to leaked electronic rhythms, but something about her movement bothered him. Micro-delays between the sound's pulse and her response, as if she existed milliseconds out of phase with her own music. The first true anomaly manifested at Lexington's 63rd. David's vision snagged on the station sign, his chest constricting as the numerals destabilized. 63rd, 62nd, 63rd again. The digits seemed to occupy multiple states simultaneously, like quantum particles refusing to collapse into a single reality. Sweat prickled along his hairline as he pulled out his phone, but the transit app displayed only expected values. His attempt to photograph the sign produced images that hurt to look at, reality blurring away from the lens like oil from water. His fingers moved automatically to document the deviation, but movement in the window caught his attention. The reflection showed an impossible contradiction. Where the packed car should have mirrored back, absolute emptiness gaped. David's heart stammered against his ribs as he turned to verify, but the space had already repopulated with passengers. Too many variables, too many anomalies. His phone felt slick in suddenly damp palms as he tried to quantify the unquantifiable. Approaching Grand Central Terminal, the automated voice announced, its familiar cadence stretched like tape, playing at the wrong speed. The sound made David's molars ache. Mrs. Crossword rose from her seat, but her movement traced a vector that violated 15 months of documented behavior. She turned right instead of left, crossing into a probability space that shouldn't exist. "Excuse me," David called out, his voice strange in the suddenly viscous air. "Your exit pattern has changed." She rotated exactly 127 degrees. His mind grabbed desperately at the measurable, her smile occurring at a frequency that set his teeth on edge. "I'm sorry?" The door. The words felt wrong in his mouth, as if language itself was becoming unreliable. 15 months of data show you always exit left. I can demonstrate. I've taken this exit every day for 12 years. Her voice played back in perfect fidelity, but its source seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as if space itself was forgetting how to transmit sound correctly. Perhaps you're thinking of someone else. The doors merged into seamless steel between them, dividing his probability space from hers. David's hands trembled as he input another outlier into his dataset. The coffee vendor's cart kept shifting coordinates, simultaneously occupying multiple positions that his mind refused to resolve into a single location. The scent of coffee oscillated between non-existence and overwhelming presence, as if reality couldn't decide which version to maintain. The wrongness propagated exponentially. Tunnel geometries twisted in ways that violated Euclidean space. Station intervals expanded and contracted according to functions he couldn't quantify. Light bent around corners that shouldn't exist, illuminating possibilities that his mind rejected, even as his eyes recorded them. His stop approached according to schedule, but when David stood, Financial Times looked up with eyes that reflected null values. The emptiness behind that gaze sent ice water through David's nervous system. "Wrong stop," the man said, his voice harmonizing with quantum fluctuations that David could somehow hear crystallizing in his skull. "This is 42nd Street." David's voice cracked as he displayed his phone screen. "The data confirms. This is 47th Street." Reality collapsed around the words, leaving David's inner ear spinning. "You get off at 42nd. David's phone still showed expected values. The station sign agreed, but as he stepped onto the platform, his stomach lurched as he realized the other passengers had shifted phase, occupying private probability spaces he could no longer access. Their forms flickered at the edges, like video feeds losing synchronization across increasing distance. The doors sealed with the sound of reality forking into parallel instances. Through the window, David observed the impossible. Each regular passenger now occupied their own personal car, separated by void spaces that defied the compression algorithms of underground transit. The sight made his vision swim, his mind struggling to process information that violated everything he'd spent years quantifying. With trembling fingers, he checked his notes one final time, but the screen displayed only garbage data, numbers trying to quantify the statistical improbability of shared space collapsing into discrete quanta of isolated experience. The screen's glow illuminated his reflection in the dark window, a pale face with wide eyes, watching reality splinter into lonely parallel lines that stretched into infinite darkness ahead. Behind him, on a platform that felt increasingly uncertain, a woman read yesterday's newspaper. The headline was, "Tomorrow's News."
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. The dual monitors cast a sickly glow across David's office, their screens filled with data that refused to remain constant. His transit tracking spreadsheet, once a fortress of order, now displayed numbers that shifted between observations, columns that reorganized themselves when he looked away, and graphs that plotted impossible geometries. Even the pixel grid seemed unstable, each point of light occupying multiple positions simultaneously. The room felt wrong, as if reality had become elastic. David adjusted his second monitor for the 11th time that morning, trying to anchor it in space. The edge of his desk appeared to curve slightly when viewed peripherally, though it snapped back to normal when directly observed. He'd started keeping a level on his desk, watching the bubble split into multiple versions of itself. His camera roll had become a gallery of impossibilities. Each photo of station signs displayed different text to different viewers, the images themselves seeming to ripple with potential alternatives. Some showed platforms that couldn't exist, architecture that violated basic physics, crowds of passengers that blurred into quantum uncertainty when examined too closely. "Christ, David, you look like you haven't slept in days." The voice fractured his concentration. Jim from analytics materialized beside his desk, coffee mug in hand. The steam rose in patterns that briefly resembled subway maps before dissolving. David watched Jim's reflection fragment across both monitors, each version slightly different, none quite matching the original. "What station do you see?" David's voice cracked as he gestured at the screens. Sweat made the mouse slip in his grip. In these photos, please, just tell me what station you see. Jim leaned closer, his cologne momentarily grounding David in normal space-time. The scent had a half-life of exactly 3 seconds before it too began oscillating between states of existence. Lex 59th, all of them. Why? That's... David swallowed against rising nausea. Watch carefully. They keep shifting. 62nd, 63rd, 65th. The numbers won't stabilize. How can you not see it? David. Jim set his mug down with deliberate care. The coffee's surface rippled in ways that violated fluid dynamics. Every single photo shows 59th Street, has been showing 59th Street, will always show 59th Street. He paused, his voice acquiring that careful modulation people use with unstable colleagues. The tone made David's skin crawl with fractal patterns. Maybe you should consider taking a different route for a while. Give yourself some distance. But the numbers kept dancing. The subway system wasn't just changing, it was evolving, adapting to accommodate multiple contradictory realities. This morning's data included topology violations that made his cerebellum ache when he tried to process them. Passenger testimonies suggested everyone was traveling through their own personally optimized version of space-time, each convinced their route was the only valid one. The thought of the evening commute made his stomach contract into geometric impossibilities. By 6 o'clock, his hands vibrated at frequencies that threatened to shatter his phone. Grand Central Terminal had become a nexus of probability collapse. David watched a woman consult the same map 3 times in succession, her finger tracing different routes that somehow all led to the same destination. Each time her face showed perfect comprehension of a completely different reality. When he stepped forward to ask what she saw, she walked through what his timeline registered as a solid wall, leaving him staring at architecture that twisted in ways that made his visual cortex short-circuit. The trains themselves had begun expressing quantum behaviors at macro scale. Each car existed in superposition, carrying infinite variations of the same passengers through branching probability spaces. David documented everything in his phone, even as his notes began retroactively editing themselves between readings. The text shifted between fonts that hadn't been invented yet, and ones that had never existed. His chest constricted when he reached Union Square. A cluster of transit workers huddled around a terminal that seemed to occupy several locations at once. Their faces reflected light from screens that displayed different information to each viewer, their urgent whispers harmonizing with the hum of reality's underlying code. "The divergence is approaching critical mass," one worker muttered, her fingers dancing across data that rewrote itself faster than human consciousness could process. The system wasn't designed to maintain this many separate realities. What divergence? David's voice emerged in frequencies that shouldn't have been audible, but they scattered before he could get answers, each taking a different path through station architecture that reconfigured itself around their individual world lines. He pressed his palm against the cold tile wall, desperate for something solid, but felt it breathe beneath his touch. His phone buzzed with messages that refused to maintain temporal consistency. "Reality customization in progress. Please maintain your designated route. Passenger reality verification attempts may cause timeline instability. Your personal path through space-time will be preserved. Do not attempt to synchronize experiences with other travelers." Each notification arrived simultaneously with its own quantum signature, the timestamps suggesting they'd been sent from moments that couldn't coexist. When David finally boarded his train home, understanding crystallized in his mind with terrible clarity. Every passenger was traveling through their own version of the subway system, each reality perfectly tailored to its occupant's worldview. Some argued violently about which line they were riding, while others sat in profound isolation, each moving through personally curated versions of underground space that happened to temporarily intersect. The final separation occurred between stations. Through windows that had become permeable to quantum truth, David watched other trains passing on impossible tracks, carrying infinite variations of the same passengers through branching realities. Each version slightly different, each absolutely certain their route was the only true one. His phone displayed one final message before its screen became a portal into another reality. Individual reality configuration complete. Please proceed along your designated timeline. Do not attempt to verify your route with other versions of yourself. In the window reflection, David watched multiple versions of himself reading slightly different messages on slightly different phones, each screen displaying truths that couldn't coexist. The sight made his inner ear revolt, his consciousness struggling to process information it wasn't designed to handle. Each David traveled through their own perfectly customized version of the underground, never to intersect again. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes against the fractaling reflections. But the image had already burned itself into his mind. Infinite Davids, infinite trains, infinite lonely journeys home through the splintering dark. Behind him, someone hummed a tune that didn't exist yet. The sound tasted like static. Chapter 3. David's apartment walls had become a manifesto of impossible cartography. Subway maps covered every surface, each showing different configurations of the same system, none of them maintaining consistency between viewings. His morning routine, once a prophylactic against chaos, now seemed like childish numerology, counting steps across a floor that sometimes forgot to meet his feet. Sleep had become mathematically improbable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw train cars splitting into quantum superpositions, each carrying a different version of himself into personally optimized darkness. The dreams, when they came, spoke in the language of topology violations and probability collapse. His hands trembled as he added another observation to his notebook, pages now warped from anxiety sweat and quantum uncertainty. The handwriting shifted between versions of itself, some entries written in manuscripts he didn't remember making, others in calligraphy that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Sometimes he'd return to find entire passages rewritten by other Davids, each documenting their own version of truth in increasingly divergent realities. The subway system's metamorphosis had accelerated beyond any pretense of normality. That morning, he'd watched stations exist in quantum superposition, each platform simultaneously serving infinite variations of the same space-time coordinates. The mathematics of it made his temporal lobe cramp, but the loneliness, God, the loneliness was worse. Passengers navigated their personal versions of the underground, each sealed in a bubble of individual truth, their eyes sliding past each other like parallel lines approaching infinity. His phone vibrated with messages from a transit authority that had abandoned the pretense of unified reality. Each notification emerged uniquely tailored to its solitary recipient. Please maintain your designated reality configuration. Cross-reality verification may cause existential destabilization. David's throat contracted as he read the next alert, the text seeming to squirm away from direct observation. Your optimized transit experience has been customized for your personal timeline. Then another, the words rewriting themselves even as he processed them. Do not attempt to synchronize experiences with other versions of yourself. And finally, making his vestigial organs shift position. Reality confluence is no longer supported at this station. He pressed his forehead against his office window, watching the lunch crowds below fragment into parallel versions of themselves. Each person moved in probability spaces that never truly intersected, their paths describing equations of perfect isolation. Had it always been this way? Had they ever really shared the same reality, or had they just been pretending all along? Near noon, he witnessed the first complete bifurcations. Entire platforms split into parallel versions, each serving a single passenger's truth. The barriers between realities had become visible now, shifting, iridescent membranes that divided the underground into infinite personal transit systems, each perfectly adapted to its sole occupant's version of truth. The sight made his visual cortex attempt to process colors that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. He found her again, the transit worker from Union Square, in a control room that existed in the quantum foam between realities. Her workspace pulsed with crystalline displays, showing countless parallel routes, each representing someone's personal version of underground truth. The screens cast light in frequencies that shouldn't have been visible to human eyes, making her expressions cycle through emotions that existed simultaneously. "We're not fighting it anymore," she said, her voice reaching him through layers of separated realities. Her hands danced across controls that seemed to bend space itself. "The system is adapting to how consciousness actually experiences the world." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting infinite parallel versions of themselves. "Nobody truly shares the same reality. We just maintain the collective illusion that we do. The subway is simply making visible what was always true." David watched, his heartbeat syncopating with quantum fluctuations, as she adjusted reality parameters, fine-tuning the boundaries between personal truths. Her monitors showed millions of individual routes, winding through private versions of the underground, never intersecting yet somehow all leading to destinations that existed differently for each traveler. "What happens," his voice fractured across probability space, "when the separation is complete?" She smiled with infinite sadness, her face briefly fragmenting into countless variations of the same expression. "What makes you think it hasn't always been this way? We're just finally seeing the truth we've spent our whole lives pretending not to notice." The final transformation began during evening rush hour. David stood on a platform that existed in countless simultaneous states, feeling reality divide itself into perfectly isolated fragments. Each passenger now occupied their own personal subway car, traveling through a version of the underground that existed solely for them, optimized for their individual perception of truth. His phone displayed its final message before becoming a window into his personal reality. "Individual transit configuration complete. Welcome to your optimized experience. Please proceed along your designated timeline. You have always been traveling alone." David's hands trembled as he boarded his train. The horrible truth settled into his bones with crystalline clarity. The truth that had always been there, hidden behind humanity's desperate attempts at connection. Every passenger had always been alone, traveling through their private versions of reality. The subway system hadn't broken down. It had evolved to reveal the fundamental truth of consciousness. Billions of separate universes, merely pretending to share the same space, each convinced their version of reality was the only true one. Through windows that had become permeable to quantum truth, he could see infinite versions of himself in parallel cars. Each believed they were the real David Smith. Each traveled through their own personally curated version of the underground. Each completely certain their reality was the correct one. Each eternally separated from all others by the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. None of them would ever meet. None of them ever had. David pressed his palm against the cold window, watching his breath fog the glass in patterns that defied entropy. The illusion of shared experience had been humanity's last defense against the truth. That consciousness itself was an act of eternal isolation, and every moment of connection had been a comforting lie we told ourselves to avoid facing the infinite loneliness of individual perception. As his train pulled away, he noticed his reflection in the window had stopped pretending to mimic his movements. It traveled its own path now, like everyone else, through its own private version of the underground. In the darkness between stations, David closed his eyes, but he could still see them. Infinite trains, carrying infinite lonely passengers, each believing they were headed home, each traveling forever through their own personal darkness. The station signs ahead displayed names in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Somewhere, in another reality, yesterday's newspaper printed tomorrow's headlines. The trains ran on schedule, but time had forgotten what that meant.
Thank you for listening to The Personal Line.